All right, so just a quick reminder that exam 3 will be on Thursday, October 31st. All right, so today we're going to start on completing the square, or solving equations using completing the square. Where for the most part you'll just see me put CTS. All right, so to complete the square, just a quick reminder. If you have an ax squared plus bx plus c, then your complete the square is equal to b divided by 2a squared. That's your complete the square formula. All right, so let's say, for example, if you wanted to complete the square for, let's say, x squared plus 10. Or better yet, x squared plus, I'll use a different number, x squared plus 12x. Okay, so we have our ax squared plus bx. Since it's in this form, well, in this case, c is equal to 0, so we don't really need it there. Our a is equal to 1. Uh-oh. Forgot to put my 12 there. And our b is equal to 12. So we know our complete the square, which is b divided by 2a squared is going to equal b, which is 12, divided by 2 times a, which is 1, squared, which is just 12 divided by 2 squared. Clean that up a little bit. Which ends up being 6 squared, which is 36. Uh-oh. Actually, I wanted to put a parentheses around that one. So before you apply that square, you want to remember that value. Okay. So you're going to add this there. Okay, so that means if you have x squared plus 12x plus 36, you now turn this into a perfect square trinomial. Because now this becomes x plus 6, that's why I wanted you to remember that value, squared. All right, any questions on that one? Okay, hopefully this looks a little familiar. All right, oh, I'll leave that up for a few seconds. So this just had us create a perfect square trinomial. Now we're going to actually solve equations using completing the square. So, all right, so first we'll go over the steps. Steps for completing the square. To solve, ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. Okay, so remember your first step. If your a is any number other than 1, you then want to divide every term by that, so the x squared just has a coefficient of 1. So if the coefficient of x squared is 1, you just go right to step 2. Let's say this is 1a and 1b. If it's any number other than 1, then you divide by that number. So if the coefficient of x squared is not a equals 1, then divide every term by that a value. So if you had 7x squared plus 5x plus 2, then you divide every term by that 7. So whatever that a value is, to make the coefficient 1. Okay. Remember, your second step, you want to isolate all your variable terms. So all of your x terms are on one side, all of your non-x terms are on the other. On the side of the equal sign. Okay, which means in this case, you would subtract both sides by c. So your third step, you're now going to calculate your completing the square. So find your completing the square value, which remember that is just b divided by 2a squared. And then you're going to add that to both sides of the equal sign. Okay, and that will give you a perfect square trinomial on the left. So if done correctly, this will give you a perfect square trinomial on the left. Okay. So then you're going to solve the equation using the square root theorem. Oh. May not necessarily be x, so I don't want to say solve for x. So using the square root theorem, square root property. Okay. Now remember your plus or minus. On that step. It's really, really easy to forget. And then for 5, you can check your answer if you want to. And that's optional. Right. So let's say, for example, we want to solve x squared minus 8x minus 5 equals 0 using completing the square. Okay. Now we couldn't do it the regular way because normally if you have nothing in front of the x squared, you just try to find two numbers that multiply to equal your c and two numbers that add to equal your b. But there's no two numbers that can multiply to equal -5 that add together to give you 8. Or -8. Okay, you can't use 5 and 1. You can't use 4 and 2, which, not 4 and 2. -1, -5, or +5, -1. You get the idea. No combination of it. All right, so we have to go with completing the square. Okay, so your first step is to check and make sure there is nothing in front of the x squared. Okay, so there's nothing in front of the x squared, so you can skip the first step. Equals 1, so you're good there. Okay, so your second step is you want to isolate all of your x variables. Or your x terms. Okay, so that means for your x squared minus 8x minus 5 equals 0, you're just going to add 5 to both sides. Okay, so these two cancel out. So you end up with x squared minus 8x equals 5. Okay, so your third step, now you find you're completing the square value. Oh, make sure I didn't skip any steps. Yep. Okay. Okay, so the third step, you know, for x squared minus 8x equals 5, your a is equal to 1, and your b is equal to -8. Okay, so you're completing the square value, which is b divided by 2a squared, is equal to -8 divided by 2 times 1, which is 2 squared, which is -4 squared. And remember, before you apply that squared, you want to remember that value, which is 16. Okay. So for this, you want to add that to both sides. I'll kind of separate that a little bit. Okay. So that's our, nope, nope, that's not our fourth step, still our third step. Okay, so we have our x squared minus 8x plus 16, which you just added, equals 5 plus 16. Okay, and remember, if you did it right, that should be a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so this should be x, and that value you were supposed to remember, just put that in there and square it. Okay, we know it equals 5 plus 16, which is 21. Okay, so we were able to turn it into x minus 4 squared equals 21. Okay, so third, apply CTS. There we go. Okay, now for the fourth step, you want to solve this using the square root property. Okay, so if we have x minus 4 squared equals 21, let me straighten up that 2 a little bit. We just square root both sides. Okay, so we have x minus 4 equals plus or minus square root of 21. Hopefully that looks a little better. Is that better or was it better before? Oh, okay. All right. So here, once we add 4 to both sides, x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 21. Okay, so that means that x can equal 4 plus square root of 21, or x can equal 4 minus square root of 21. And you can plug it in and check it if you like, but you don't have to. Oh, move that up a little bit. All right, any questions on that one? All right, for the next example, let's say if we wanted to solve x squared plus 4x plus 1 equals 0. All right, so once again, we look at it and we think nothing in front of the x squared. I might be able to just factor it the old-fashioned way. Unfortunately, you try to find two numbers that multiply to equal 1. You can't find those same two numbers that add to equal 4. So you can't factor it the easy way. Okay, but you can also look at it and say, okay, we have a squared value here and a squared value there. Might be a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so let's rewrite it. So x squared plus 4x plus 1 squared equals 0. Okay, so remember, for your perfect square trinomial, a squared plus 2ab plus b squared is equal to a plus b squared. And your a squared minus 2ab plus b squared is a minus b squared. So here, if we make our a equal to x and our b equal to 1, we have our a squared and our b squared. Well, we're using this one up here. Now we just have to see if our middle term equals 2 times a times b, which gives us 2 times a, which is x, Yeah, let me move that, clear it up a little bit. So 2 times x times 1, which does not equal 4x. Okay, so just because the first term and last term are perfect squares doesn't mean it's always going to be a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so this one's not a perfect square. Okay, so that means we use completing the square. Okay, so we can kind of separate that. Okay, so remember our first step. Want to make sure there's nothing in front of the x squared. So our a is equal to 1, so we go right to step 2. Okay. Second step is we're going to bring all of our non-x terms to the other side. So x squared plus 4x plus 1 equals 0. Once we subtract 1 from both sides, we end up with x squared plus 4x equals negative 1. Okay, so now our third step, we complete the square. Okay, so we know that for this, your a is equal to 1, and your b is equal to 4. Okay, so since our completing the square formula is b divided by 2a squared, that's going to equal 4 divided by 2 times 1, so 4 divided by 2 squared, which is 2 squared. And that value before you apply your square, you want to remember that, which is 4. Okay. So this is the value you're going to add to both sides. Okay, so your x squared plus 4x plus 4, remember that's the value you added, equals negative 1 plus 4. Okay, and if you did everything right, this should be a perfect square trinomial using that value that hopefully you remembered. X plus 2 squared equals negative 1 plus 4 is 3. Okay, so now we solve that using the square root property. Okay, so our x plus 2 squared, bring that up a little bit, equals 3. We go ahead and square root both sides. The square and the square root cancels out. So that's x plus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 3. Subtract 2 from both sides. We have x equals negative 2 plus or minus square root of 3. Or if you want to separate it, x equals negative 2 plus square root of 3, or x equals negative 2 minus square root of 3. That or that. All right. Any questions on that one? All right. I'll leave that up for a few seconds. All right. Okay, so let's say for the next one, we wanted to solve 6x squared plus 5x minus 6 equals 0 by completing the square. Okay, so the ones before this all had a's that equal 1, so we were able to kind of skip the first step. So with this one, we can't skip the first step because the x squared has a coefficient that's a number other than 1. And it's going to shut off in